Good evening to everybody. This is Dr. Soul Brother, and I'm streaming live right now. Um, first of all, I want to apologize. My plan was to be on last month in April. However, I had quite a few interruptions that got in the way, so that didn't happen. Um, I wanted to say that I felt it important to do a documentary, or what am I saying, documentary? Do a program tribute to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I actually wanted to do this last month, but wasn't able to. But it's interesting, as coincidence would have it. I understand that there's a new book out now, um, titled, uh, the author's name is Jonathan Eig, and it's a new biography out on Dr. King. So I have not read it, although I am familiar with Jonathan Ive as a writer, but I don't know. I can't comment on the book because I have not read it. But that is something that I think will be an important book to look into, because in many ways Dr. King is not um, properly understood in a lot of ways. So um, let me do this here. Let me just get straight to the point. A man by the name of Michael Luther King Jr. was born January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. His name as he got older was changed to to Martin Luther King Jr. Um, in homage to the reformist Martin Luther. So I thought it important to try to focus on Dr. King and who he was and what he represented. First of all, one of the things that frankly bothers me is that while Dr. King was clearly um, a person who, um, while Dr. King was somebody who was truly about the upliftment of people throughout history, he's somebody who has been maligned for a whole host of reasons. Did Dr. King have his faults? Who doesn't? But to turn around and malign somebody who put his heart soul on the line, um, on behalf of black people in America, is a crime as far as I'm concerned. Um, and I want to help to put a dent into this. Again, this is Dr. Soul Brother, broadcasting live, and want to pay proper homage to our brother, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And again, I want to say again, in case people are just now tuning in, I want to apologize for just now getting back. I was supposed to get gotten back last month, but unfortunately, I had a lot of interruptions, so that didn't happen. Anyway, getting back to this here, Dr. King is somebody who um, went to Morehouse College at age 15. Um, this is a time when um, uh, he said got into Morehouse College at age 15. This is around the time that he uh, during World War II, when there was a shortage of um, males on college campuses. So Dr. King was able to exit high school early. Now, Dr. King was the son of a minister. His father, uh, Martin Luther King Sr., was from Stockbridge, Georgia. He was a country boy, so he was from the rural community of Stockbridge. Dr. King's mother, Alberta, was, I believe, a native of Atlanta. I could be wrong, but if anyone knows, please correct me. Um, Dr. King's mother attended an HBCU in Georgia, Dr. King's father attended an HBCU in Georgia. So what you have is Dr. King was the second generation in his family to not only go to college but to have gone to an HBCU. Dr. King's father, who, as I mentioned, was from Stockbridge, Georgia, which is the rural part um, of Georgia, he received his bachelor's from bachelor's degree in theology from Morehouse College. Um, Dr. King's mother was a college graduate of an HBCU in in Georgia. She didn't go to Spelman, but I believe she went to Clark College, if I'm not mistaken. At any rate, they got married and had three children. Um, Martin Luther King Jr., Alfred, known as A.D. King, and uh, Christina King. So they had two sons and one daughter. Interestingly, Dr. King's uh, sister is still in the land of the living, and so she's with us still. But getting back to Dr. King, I don't want to go into a long thing about his background in terms of, um, you know, where he went to school, although that's important, where he went to school and all the rest of it. I think it's important to note that Dr. King came from a family of who were activists. His grandfather, his maternal grandfather, played a role as um, a minister. In fact, it's interesting. Dr. King came from a family of ministers. His father was a minister. His grandfather was a minister, and I think there were a couple of other pastors in that line. So, and it's really no different from people who come from families where, let's say, they were educators and all of that. Well, the thing is this: um, the community in which Dr. King came from was a was self-contained, and in spite of the fact that Atlanta, Georgia, was represented the segregated South, um, Dr. King's background, whether you're talking about a middle class background in terms of his nuclear household or his family on his father's side that were sharecroppers. I failed to mention that part. There is his paternal side of the family. They were sharecroppers. Um, they were rooted in the black culture of the time. And the black culture at that time was much different than it is now, which at some point I'm going to do a broadcast on that because I think that's important to know and understand that much of the stuff that you see going on right now on a negative tip was not always the case back in the day. And of course, things were far from perfect. We're just dealing with human beings. And of course, when you start talking about uh, um, the black community, um, back in the day, things were not while things were not perfect, they certainly were not what you see today. Much of that is, you know, look at the fact that we're talking about the South at the time, where people were had a sense of certain values. You know, Dr. King, truth be told, was liberal when it came to bread and butter issues, but conservative when it came to values. And so, many ways, Dr. King's upbringing was indicative of the black community in particular and the overall American society at large, overall. But I think it's important to know and understand that the there are things as a man I knew once said, well, not once, he said to me more than once, we're all a sum total of our life experiences. And I think that's very true. All of those experiences help to shape and mold us. So Dr. King was clearly one of those who was shaped and molded by his family, his community, and the overall American society. When you fast forward to Dr. King's life as a youngster, as an undergraduate student at Morehouse College, an HBCU, graduating uh, from Morehouse at age 19. Typically, you're 18, 19 years old, entering college, where he was exiting for the reasons I stated earlier. Well, he goes off to theological school in Pennsylvania and gets a postgraduate degree there, and then moves to Boston and gets his PhD. Now, there was a point when Dr. King um, meets his wife, Coretta Scott King, or she was Coretta Scott at the time, and they are courting. I'm going old school on you here, but that's the term, courting. And then they um, get married, and then get a family together. They're in Atlanta. I'm sorry, not Atlanta. In and I believe Montgomery, Alabama, where he starts a family. Dr. King, in many ways, is thrust into the civil rights movement, the burgeoning civil rights movement. When the bus boycott takes place, where Mrs. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, and there's um, uh, the bus boycott that takes place that goes on for about a year. Um, Dr. King is thrust into the movement again. This is not something that he planned to do. It's just that people could see his potential and all the rest of it. And so the rest is history. From 1955 until 1968, the year of his assassination, Dr. King was in the movement. So we're talking about a 13-year stretch. And while this is going on, Dr. King is um, constantly um, becoming more and more of a radical. I know that sounds strange to hear that term radical because he subscribed to um, the philosophy of nonviolence influenced by Mahatma Gandhi of India. But Dr. King, in many ways, was a radical. And if you really study his life, and I'm eager to read Jonathan Ives' book, um, King a Life, and want to get a sense of, you know, how he portrays Dr. King, because one of the things I did see or hear in an interview that Jonathan Ike did with Tavis Smiley earlier in the week, he mentions that Dr. King was always radical. And so this notion that he became radical in the mid to late 60s is a false part of the narrative. So I'd be curious to see for myself what all he has to say regarding that. But anyway, getting back to Dr. King, I want to say this, that um, for a long time, Dr. King was um, um, misunderstood. And then, but it's one thing to be misunderstood, it's another thing to be um, maligned. Well, Dr. King at some point became maligned. And unfortunately, Dr. King became maligned at a time during the 1960s by even some in the black community. If you look at the fact that simultaneously, as the civil rights movement is gaining momentum, you also have the Nation of Islam gaining momentum. And of course, the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad was Malcolm X. And one of the things, quite frankly, that happened was Dr. King, as well as other black ministers, black preachers in the Christian church, were criticized and downright maligned. And much of that, not all of it, but much of it came from the Nation of Islam. And part of that had to do with the fact that the Nation of Islam at that time felt that they were in competition with the black church, which to me is a conversation for another day. But um, if anyone looks at any film footage of Dr. King when he came to Los Angeles, this is against the backdrop of the Watts riots that took place. You had people who were hostile towards Dr. King, and much of that hostility came from the influence of the Nation of Islam. And even though at this time Malcolm X had been assassinated, I think he was assassinated, yeah, a few months. February of 1965, and then the rebellion of 65 in Los Angeles took place in August of that year. The influence was still there, and not only that, the Nation of Islam was still at it in terms of um, lampooning, if you will, black ministers and the black church, etc. So Dr. King became a victim of that. Now, when you look at what Dr. King was doing at that time, he was putting his heart and soul on the line. He went into areas that he didn't have to. And this is a man who he did like this. While you can say, well, I don't agree with his nonviolence philosophy. Okay, that's fine, no problem. But it becomes a problem when you're either sitting on the sidelines doing nothing yourself, and or you are attacking someone, calling him an Uncle Tom, calling him uh, other kinds of unflattering names when it's not necessary. When he's doing a lot of the heavy lifting, going to jail. I mean, there was a point in Dr. King's life where he um, in Mississippi, okay, which was rife with racism. Uh, they put him, I think, of one of those penitentiaries, and so here he was putting his heart and soul on the line. And here you have people coming along, and you want to be critical of Dr. King, and you're all you're doing, as we say today, throwing shade. No, somebody has to you, what are you doing? Well, anyway, um, he went to jail, in and out of jail, and this is at a time when going to jail was viewed negatively in the black community. Much of that has changed now, but again, that's a conversation for another day. But I think it's important whether you agree, disagree with his philosophy, strategies, etc. You have to give it up for a man who put his heart and soul on the line. He, his family were robbed of a father. And when I say robbed of a father, I'm not a husband and father, not just the fact that he was assassinated. I'm talking about even before then. Remember, he spent a lot of time away from home, involved in the movement, trying to negotiate, have meetings with people like John Kennedy, who was president at the time. And then when he was assassinated, when his vice president, who became president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, um, Dr. King was in the White House, and there were some things going on there where he was trying to get things done on behalf of black folk and burning the midnight oil, if you will. And not only that, when he, at some point in 1966, decides to leave the South temporarily and move to Chicago, Illinois, where in many ways he committed class suicide, so to speak. And while there, he got involved with um, trying to help black folks move into Cicero, Illinois, outside of Chicago. And at that time, white folk were not very um, they were not very pleased about black folks trying to move into their neighborhood. And why were they trying to move in the neighborhood? Because at that time, um, you had black folk who were circumscribed um, as related to the ghetto. And not only that, Dr. King, when he was living in Chicago, was in a neighborhood where he was paying high rent in a slum. Now, how many people were living like that? Who would actually do that? He didn't have to go to Chicago. He could have stayed right where he was in the South. But he began to broaden the movement in many ways. Okay. Now, if you go on and look at um, the fact everyone talks about when he uh, the "I Have a Dream" speech that he gave in 1963, and all that's true. However, um, he went on to other things. He received a Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 in Europe. He, as I mentioned, he came to Los Angeles and unfortunately was met with hostility from some people who considered themselves young toughs and had been influenced by the Nation of Islam. I'm telling you, the Nation of Islam was largely responsible for this anti-black church sentiment. And if one doubts what I'm saying, all one has to do is look at what's happening today, and you can see and hear this anti-black church sentiment. At some point, I'm going to do a program on that, and we're going to get to the root of it. And in fact, at some point, I would even welcome people to call in, but I'll take things one step at a time. What ended up happening was, as time progressed, Dr. King was troubled by the Vietnam War, and he decided to speak out against it. Now, once he spoke out against the Vietnam War, of course, things began to change. As long as he was dealing with things, dealing with uh, things on the home front, that was one thing. But then when he spoke out against the Vietnam War, and he saw the connection between what was happening in Vietnam and capitalism, that became a problem in the minds of some people. But then we also have to look at this two things. One, uh, Dr. King always aligned himself with the least of these. And you say, well, here's a man who he was a minister, he was college educated. Yeah, all that's true. But you also have to factor this in. He was a minister, and he recognized, as the scripture says, to whom much is given, much is required. But not only that, I mentioned earlier that Daddy King, affectionately known, who was Martin Luther King Sr., his father, came from humble beginnings, son of sharecroppers. So Dr. King never divorced himself, though he grew up in a middle class neighborhood, middle class household. Parents were both college educated and all the rest of it. He never distanced himself from the underclass. In fact, just take a moment here and say that when you listen to Dr. King, of course, while you could distinguish him, let's say, from somebody who was a sharecropper, um, at the same time, if you listen to his cadence, you could tell that there was some ruralness in his background, even though he himself did not come from a rural neighborhood or a rural household. Because remember now, even though his father, and that's one of the unique things, and I dare say beautiful things, Dr. King's father, who was the son of sharecroppers, who was the first in his family to receive a college education, um, you could hear the the ruralness in his father never left, and some of that, to some degree, spilled over in uh, to his son Martin Jr. The other thing that lets you know something about Dr. King's background is that he referred to his grandmother, someone he idolized, as Big Mama. Now, that alone lets you know something about um, the economic background of the family. Okay, Big Mama, and also Dr. King loved soul food. Okay, so in many ways, Dr. King was a soul brother. He loved soul food. He um, he was very down to earth. He didn't get caught up in highfalutin titles, and all of that. As a matter of fact, he um, also liked to shoot pool, and he also dug soul music. So again, Dr. King in many ways was a soul brother. But I'm going to wind things down here in a few minutes because I'm not going to keep everybody long. But I want to say this: when you look at what Dr. King was doing regarding uh, the garbage man strike that took place in 1968, February 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, when uh, black men were receiving really pittance for. I mean, you were basically eking out a living, unlike today. You can survive off of the income for garbage men today, and of course, there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that helped to change that. But the point is, this is somebody, Dr. King, who again didn't have to get involved, but he chose to. Again, going back to the scripture, looking out for the least of these, and to whom much is given, much is required. The other thing about Dr. King took pride in his blackness. In many ways, he, when you look at when he talked about taking pride in our hair, when we were taught that our hair was ugly, when our hair was negative, our hair was bad, etc. Dr. King, on the other hand, um, he looked at it and said, "No, our hair is good hair." He gave a sermon dealing with that. I believe in it was a New Year's sermon in 1968. Anybody can look that up. That's one. The other thing is that we also had to keep in mind our brother Harry Belafonte, who recently passed on, may he rest in peace, was a very close confidant of Dr. King. They met in the mid 1950s and and remained friends until Dr. King's assassination. In many ways, Mr. Harry Belafonte was responsible for bankrolling um, much of the civil rights movement, which is a story in and of itself. But um, uh, whenever an event were to take place, you could always rely on Mr. B, as he was referred to, Harry Belafonte, to get involved and give a helping hand. So Dr. King would call on him many times. But Dr. King is someone again. I have not read this new book that's out. Um, I'm going to read it at some point, and maybe I'll do a broadcast on that. And who knows, maybe even get a chance to interview the author. That would be great. But here's the thing. Um, I think it's important for people to know that yes, Dr. King had flaws like any human being does, and you weigh things on a scale, and whatever negative things that that we have about us as human beings, if they don't outweigh the positive, then leave the individual alone. And I'm saying that to say this. I've noticed some things on this internet with some people, and unfortunately, frankly, some people who look like us, who have chosen to amplify those things that they would deem as negative. And what ends up happening is they cause those things that they deem as negative to discount all of the positives, all of the sacrifices, and whatnot that Dr. King made. Because again, the work that he put in is not something he had to do. He really didn't. He could have just, after getting his doctorate, taught at a university and just kicked it, but he didn't. And I also want to add this: when you look at the profile of somebody like Dr. King, he was a Christian, a Baptist minister, a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. He went grad chapter. He was in the Masonic Lodge. He was a member of the Boule. Yes, a member of the Boule. And contrary to what is out there, the Boule members are not adversaries of the black community. I'm going to say that again. The Boule members are not adversaries of the black community, contrary to the talking heads who are out there. And there's a reason why people are of that mindset. And I'll deal with a show on that in the not too distant future. But Dr. King is someone who needs to be remembered in a positive way. Those things that he did that we benefit, there are things that we benefit from now as a result of the blood, sweat, and tears of his work. And I think it is a crime, a real crime, for people to reduce, to be dismissive and to um, malign him and all of those negative things, especially if you yourself didn't do the heavy lifting or weren't even around yet. Because there are many people walking around who weren't even born when Dr. King, and well as others, who were involved in the movement to make things better in overall society. And I'll end by saying this: when Dr. King, and I'll say this: Mr. Tavis Smiley is the one who has made it clear of what a true patriot is. It is Dr. King who represents true patriotism. He had the best interests of his country. And when you look at what he was trying to organize for the Poor People's March, unfortunately, he didn't live to see come into fruition. And even though you had people who were trying to get things done while he was gone, or no longer with us, I should say, it didn't really get off the ground the way they would have liked to. But nevertheless, um, Poor People's March for black, brown, red, yellow, and white people in this country, the least of these. He had his fellow countrymen regardless of colors, best interests at heart. And he was definitely trying to make things better for everyone, black people in particular, but everyone in general. That is a true patriot. These other folk you see out here who profess, who purport to love America, really don't. Yes, I'm talking about these MAGA folk. They don't love America. The proof is in the pudding. You judge people by what they do, not by what they say. And I think it's evident that Dr. King had America's best interests at heart. He recognized, and in fact, he said, all we're saying to America, be true to what you said on paper. So, in closing, these talking heads who like to be on social media and want to engage in character assassination, let me be real clear. Um, you need to watch yourself with that because you're exhibiting disrespect in ways that you don't even realize, or maybe you don't even care. But you really need to watch yourself with that because that right there, it clearly shows that you're out of line. I'm going to end here. And just so you know, I plan to be back on tomorrow. And tomorrow's show will be a birthday tribute to Malcolm X. May 19th, 1925 is when Malcolm X was born. And I will discuss further about the relationship between Dr. King and Malcolm X. And I will also want to go into areas regarding Malcolm X in terms of his metamorphosis that unfortunately not enough scholars, not enough historians deal with. So, this is Dr. Soul Brother signing off for now. And until I see you